All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're mapping out the really dramatic ideological journey of J.D. Vance. We're looking at the fascinating trajectory of a guy who evolved from being a fierce, very public critic of Donald Trump to actually becoming his vice presidential running mate. By unpacking the source material from a recent, super in-depth interview, we're going to see exactly how his personal history, his military service, and his shifting perspectives on global and domestic issues all came together to create a highly unconventional political worldview.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with his roots of chaos and stability, then move into military and institutional disillusionment, followed by the Trump transformation, his pragmatic foreign policy, and finally, AI, society, and faith. Let's get into it. Starting off with Section 1, Roots of Chaos and Stability. To really get where the politician is coming from, we first have to look at the incredibly chaotic environment of his early childhood in the working-class Midwest. Because honestly, this is the foundation for everything that comes later. Vance describes a home life that was deeply fractured by his mother's severe addiction to prescription drugs and eventually heroin. And alongside that addiction was a constant, unpredictable turnover of father figures. Just think about the heavy emotional toll of that revolving door for a kid. He notes that by the time he was a teenager, this constant churn had instilled a deep inherent mistrust of unstable circumstances. He basically felt like relationships were fundamentally chaotic and that the world was, at its core, a place where the floor could just drop out from underneath you at absolutely any moment.
But amidst all that storm, there was an anchor. His grandmother, who he called Mamaw, provided the singular stabilizing force in his life. And she was incredibly tough. Vance even shares this really stark anecdote where she threatened to run over a neighborhood kid with her car if he kept introducing young JD to drugs. I mean, it sounds extreme, right? But it was exactly this brand of fierce, uncompromising tough love that kept him on the straight and narrow. She provided the one safe harbor in an otherwise entirely chaotic world.
Now, you might be wondering, why does this matter to us today? Well, because this early chaos fundamentally shaped his worldview as an adult. Vance admits this turbulent background resulted in an avoidant attachment style and a deeply ingrained suspicion that things outside of his control will, eventually, inevitably, fall apart. But on the flip side, it also gave him a remarkably high empathy quotient. Because he's seen people at their absolute best and their absolute worst, he tends to assume the best about the everyday struggles of working-class people. That early chaos is the exact lens through which he views the American working class today. Okay, moving right along to Section 2, Military and Institutional Disillusionment.
Following the tragic events of 9/11 during his junior year of high school, Vance was driven by a profound sense of duty. He likened it to his generation's version of World War II. Guided by that calling, he actually enlisted in the Marine Corps in 2003 and then deployed to Iraq between 2005 and 2006. This journey fostered an immense, lifelong respect for the troops on the ground. But, and this is a big but, it simultaneously planted the seeds of a deep, abiding cynicism toward the leadership that actually sent them there.
To explain this shift, Vance introduces a really interesting concept he calls the patriotic reservoir. Think of this as a nation's inherent willingness, particularly among its youth, to step up and sacrifice for their country in times of true existential threat. He argues that leaders have a sacred duty to cultivate this reservoir and to never, ever exploit it. In his view, the Bush administration completely squandered this vital national asset by directing the country into an Iraq war based on fundamentally flawed premises and bad intelligence. So this right here is an absolutely crucial pivot point. His military experience catalyzed a growing belief that America's establishment leaders and elite institutions were fundamentally broken. He went into the military believing the experts knew exactly what they were doing, and he came out believing they were entirely untrustworthy. This loss of faith in the so-called establishment is the foundational crack in his worldview. Keep that in mind because it's the exact lens we need to understand his next major pivot in public life. Which brings us to Section 3. The Trump transformation. This is the elephant in the room, right? It's a question asked by so many observers. How exactly does someone go from privately comparing a politician to America's Hitler in 2016 to becoming his fiercely loyal running mate in 2024? What on earth was the intellectual and ideological journey there? Well, this brilliantly illustrates the flip. Back in 2016, Vance wrote that Donald Trump was offering simple, cynical solutions to the complex pain of the working class. But by 2024, his perspective had completely inverted. He concluded that his initial alignment with the experts was actually a mistake. He decided that traditional institutions were failing and sclerotic. Therefore, Trump's exact misalignment with those experts wasn't a flaw. It was the feature. It was a necessary, blunt weapon required to disrupt a system that was already broken.
Vance explicitly states that witnessing Trump's presidency from the outside proved his initial assumptions wrong. He argues that he had to honestly acknowledge his own error. He thought the military and scientific experts were usually right, but realized they often weren't. For Vance, Trump's unconventional, abrasive approach to governance was validated simply by the fact that the conventional, polite approach had systematically failed the people it was supposed to serve.
Let's shift gears now to Section 4, Pragmatic Foreign Policy.
We see that same unconventional disruption apply to global affairs, where Vance views foreign policy not through a lens of idealism, but strict, hard-nosed pragmatism. A prime example detailed in the source is his approach to Iran. Vance outlines a highly transactional peace deal term sheet. In this framework, traditional diplomatic norms are just completely bypassed. It reads more like a corporate merger. The U.S. offers severe economic sanctions relief and global reintegration. In direct exchange, Iran must open the Strait of Hormuz, demine the waterways, and submit to verifiable long-term nuclear inspections. It's a radical, business-like approach to a decades-old, deeply entrenched conflict.
And this purely transactional approach also extends to historic allies. When discussing Israel, Vance insists that while interests often align, like degrading Iranian conventional military power, the United States is the undisputed superpower. He frames the dynamic strictly as a senior partner versus a junior partner. He asserts that the distinct objectives and security of the United States must always come first, even if it requires incredibly difficult or tense conversations with allied leadership.
He summarizes his foreign policy stance with a remarkably blunt admission: I don't really trust anybody. Notice how this powerfully echoes that inherent mistrust of unstable circumstances stemming from his chaotic childhood. In global affairs, he maintains a strictly realist view of international relations. He believes that a constant laser-focused pursuit of American interests is the only reliable compass. Blind trust in any foreign entity, whether a historic ally or a known adversary, is to him a massive strategic vulnerability. Finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, AI, Society, and Faith. Vance's personal spiritual journey closely mirrors his political evolution. He grew up in an unchurched evangelical home and then transitioned into what he describes as an arrogant, angry atheist while aggressively pursuing elite credentials at Yale Law School. But eventually, he found himself deeply unfulfilled by mere ambition and resume building. This realization led him back to faith, eventually being baptized as a Christian as an adult. He was seeking a moral framework that prioritized virtue, family, and community far above raw individual achievement. Now, this moral framework directly colors his view of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence. Interestingly, he's not actually overly worried about mass job loss, comparing the dawn of AI to the Industrial Revolution, which ultimately created more jobs than it destroyed. However, he is deeply worried about a dystopian spike in extreme wealth inequality, where AI monopolies make the richest unimaginably richer while the wages of the working class violently stagnate. He also fears the potential for AI to act as a communist technology used for mass corporate and government surveillance. To combat this potential AI dystopia, he draws on Christian concepts of social harmony, specifically citing Pope Leo XIII. He argues for an economic concept called pre-distribution. Let's break that down for a second. Instead of the traditional liberal model of letting massive corporations make trillions and just hoping the government steps in to tax and redistribute it later, pre-distribution demands giving workers a seat at the bargaining table to share in the wealth as it is created. In short, it means building worker benefits into the system from day one, rather than taxing monopolies after the fact. So, to summarize this explainer, his entire platform is anchored in a firm rejection of conventional wisdom, driven by the deep instability of his youth, tempered by an abiding mistrust of the institutions that he feels lied to his generation during the Iraq War. He demands pragmatic disruption. He believes the old systems are broken, and new, radically transactional methods, guided by a profound desire for social harmony and pre-distribution, are the only way forward. We want to leave you with this final thought to consider. What happens when a deep distrust of the system becomes the system itself? As we move into an era of unprecedented technological and global shifts, will this unconventional, combative approach to governance fix the sclerosis of our institutions, or will it create the very chaos he sought to escape in his youth? Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and keep questioning the frameworks that shape our world.